Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, March 7th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The House is expected to vote on a war powers resolution to withdraw troops from Syria this Wednesday. So, this is a resolution that was introduced by Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida, and it would order President Biden to withdraw all U.S. troops from Syria. So, really, the point of this article here is to try to get some pressure on members of Congress by us, going to the phones and calling our representatives to urge them to support this resolution. It is called HCon Res 21. And, if you don't know who your representative is, you could always, or you don't know the number, which, I'm sure you don't, it's really easy to call the House switchboard operator. It's the Capitol switchboard operator. You could connect to both your House representative or your senator by dialing this number, which is 202-224-3121. And right now, it's a vote that's going to be up in the House. So you want to talk to your representative. And you could also find them online. There's a link in this article here where you can just put in your zip code. I could put the link in the description of the show. Just this is really important resolution, and it was introduced by Gates. I went over it when it was first introduced. And the situation in Syria right now, which I cover a lot, the U.S. has about 900 troops stationed in eastern Syria. And Gates's resolution would give President Biden 180 days to end the U.S. military occupation, which is, of course, opposed by Damascus. And this is a war powers resolution. He initially, when Gates first introduced the resolution, it gave the president only 15 days to withdraw from Syria. But he actually introduced another one with the longer timeline to gain more support for the effort in Congress. The longer timeline will make it more likely that Democrats will vote in favor of the bill. Back in July 2022, the House voted on a proposed amendment to the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, and that was introduced by Jamal Bowman. He's a Democrat from New York. And this amendment would have cut all funding for the U.S. presence in Syria within 1 year if Biden didn't get authorization for the war. So essentially, a 1 year timeline for a withdrawal. So Gates reintroduced it to 180 days, so about a 6 month withdrawal timeline. And hopefully, Bowman and the other Democrats that voted for the 1 year timeline are going to support this. That amendment that Bowman introduced, it failed. It didn't, by the numbers, it doesn't look very good, but it did receive support from about 60% of House Democrats, which is pretty significant. But only 25 Republicans voted in favor. So that's pretty small. So hopefully, again, this gets the Democrats support and more Republican support. Who knows exactly how this is going to go, but even if it doesn't pass, a strong outcome here could still change things. It could get the Pentagon nervous about, you know, if they're going to have to wind this war down soon in the future, and this could lead to more efforts in Congress, especially if Gates is working with Democrats on this in the future to try again and gain more support. And this comes, after Milley just made his recent visit to Syria over the weekend to justify the continued U.S. presence. He said that the fight against ISIS was worth keeping this going, but this, occupation is very much about the U.S. economic war against Syria, against Damascus, against the Syrian people. Because the area that they control is where most of the country's oil and wheat fields are located, and they deprive the rest of the country of these resources. So it's a very cruel policy, especially with the sanctions. And another thing is that this always risks sparking a major war in the region. The Russia has a presence in Syria, Iran has a presence in Syria. It's just a tripwire for something big. And there has been reports, there has been encounters between Russian and U.S. troops in Syria. And Gates, that's something Gates pointed out when he introduced the initial resolution. Not to mention just it puts U.S. troops in harm's way. There's again about 900, and U.S. bases frequently come under rocket and drone attacks. There's rarely casualties lately, but still, I mean, it's pretty often that rockets are fired at these bases. So it's a huge risk being there. And despite what Milley says, saying that it's worth fighting ISIS, if the U.S. pulled out, the Syrian government and their allies are very much against ISIS. They would work against ISIS with the Kurdish force that the U.S. backs there. So it's not like that's going to end. So we should support this. And I know it might sound naive to say call your representative, but I think when something like this is in Congress, I think we should show our support for it. So please, if you could just make the call, that would be awesome. And let me know if you do. All right, the next one here. Speaking of cruelty in Syria, Israel launched an airstrike that hit the Aleppo airport in Syria. So, an Israeli airstrike hit Syria's Aleppo International Airport early Tuesday, damaging the runway and putting the airport out of service. And this is according to the Syrian news agency Sana. A Syrian military source said, quote, at 2:07 a.m., the Israeli enemy carried out an air attack from the sea towards the international airport in Aleppo, which caused material damage to it. And as a result, it was not operating, end quote. So far, there have been no reports of casualties in the strike, and Israel has not commented on the incident. And they typically don't take credit for individual airstrikes in Syria, so their silence is normal in a scenario like this. So this strike, of course, it comes about 1 month after the devastating earthquake that hit northwest Syria and Turkey, and Aleppo was severely damaged in this earthquake. I just linked to an article from BBC, actually. They had journalists that traveled to Aleppo after the earthquake. They reported tens of thousands of people lost their homes and hundreds had died. And that was in early February, and the death tolls have gone up so much since. At the time, the overall death toll, including Turkey and Syria, was around 11,000. Now I believe it's around 60,000. So in Aleppo alone, it could be thousands that are dead. I'm not sure exactly. But they also said hospitals were overflowing with patients, and they spoke with hospital staff who said they were struggling, and they mentioned how sanctions, were hurting their response. But so since the earthquake hit Syria, the country has been receiving more international aid, including deliveries that came through the Aleppo airport. They've been getting aid through this airport, and Israel bombed it. Israel really stepped up their airstrikes against Syria's airports last year. They claim that they are targeting Iranian weapons shipments. And that's how they always frame their operations in Syria. They say that their operations against Iran, their airstrikes are against Iran, but they often kill Syrians and damage civilian infrastructure. The last known Israeli airstrike in Syria hit a residential building in Damascus on February 19th, killing at least 5 people. Again, they're saying this airport's out of service. They've bombed Syria's airports out of service before. Sometimes it took a while to get them back up. I believe the last time it didn't take long. It was it was only out of service for a few hours, so I'm not sure what the situation is here, but any updates on this strike, I'll definitely have for you. All right, the next one here. Ukraine wants the U.S. to provide cluster bombs. So this is a request that Ukraine has been making throughout the war, but now they are asking for a specific type of cluster bomb that they want to adapt so it can be dropped from drones. And this is according to Adam Smith, who's a House representative from Washington, and Jason Crow, who's another Democrat in the House from Colorado. They said that Ukraine is seeking the MK-20, which is an air-delivered cluster bomb. They said Ukrainian officials were asking members of Congress to persuade the White House to sign off on the delivery during the recent Munich Security Conference. Cluster munitions scatter small bombs over large areas, making them more indiscriminate than other munitions. According to Reuters, the MK-20 releases 240 dart-like sub-munitions, or bomblets, as they call them, little bombs that are released. And in a lot of cases, these tiny bombs that are released, they often don't explode on impact, and that makes them a huge danger to civilians who come across them. It's similar to landmines. And there is the a treaty that bans cluster munitions. It's called the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions. It has over 100 signatories, but the US, Russia, and Ukraine, they are not parties to this treaty. And since Russia launched its invasion last year, both Russian and Ukrainian forces have used cluster munitions. And Kiev, the Ukrainian government, was also accused of using the bombs in populated areas of Donetsk way back in 2014. And, I think that just highlights that they're something that a lot of people, forget about, that there was a war going on in eastern Ukraine from 2014 until the Russian invasion, which is really another phase of this war. And they were using cluster munitions in populated civilian areas. The Ukrainian government was against that region. So while the U.S. has not banned cluster bombs, the U.S. hasn't been using them in recent years, at least, and not in any incidents that we know about. The last time U.S. forces used them was in 2009 in Yemen. But the U.S. has been producing and selling cluster bombs to its allies until a few years ago. In 2016, a company called Textron Systems Corporation, they stopped producing this MK-20 bomb that Ukraine wants. And they stopped producing them when the U.S. stopped selling them to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was using them in Yemen. We know how brutal they are when it comes to bombing civilians. A congressional aide told Reuters that there are about 1 million of these bombs still in U.S. military stockpiles. So that's quite a bit. Senator Lindsey Graham also said that Ukrainian officials were pushing for U.S. lawmakers to pressure the Biden administration to provide cluster bombs in Munich during that security conference. Graham, of course, favors sending the munitions and said that he would lobby for them this week. Besides the MK-20s, Ukraine also wants 155 millimeter cluster artillery shells. So Adam Smith, he does not think that the Biden administration is going to sign off on sending cluster bombs. Now, there's always a chance that they could provide them, quietly, secretly under the table. There has been a few cases where Ukraine ends up with a weapon that the Pentagon didn't announce that they were sending. So I think that's always a possibility. And then Crow, the other Democrat that they talked to that was talking about this, said that he might support arming Ukraine with this MK-20 if Kiev would remove the bomblets and use them individually as opposed to using them as cluster bombs. So using them as just little tiny bombs, I guess, so they could, maybe that's what they're thinking for dropping them from drones. I'm not sure, but Ukraine again has been asking for the other types of cluster bombs throughout the war. So we'll see how that plays out. All right, the next one here. Ukraine's top generals want to keep fighting for Bakhmut, or that's what Zelensky says, at least. So Zelensky said on Monday that his top generals want to keep fighting for the eastern Donetsk city of Bakhmut, where Russian and Ukrainian forces have been locked in a heavy battle for over 8 months. So Zelensky made the comments after meeting with several high-level military officials, including General Valery Zaluzhny, and he's the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces. Zelensky said after the meeting, quote, this is actually a statement from Zelensky's office after the meeting. It said, quote, "They spoke in favor of continuing the defense operation and further strengthening our positions in Bakhmut," end quote. So that was, them referencing the position of these top Ukrainian military officials. However, earlier in the day, the German tabloid Bild reported that Zaluzhny gave different advice a few weeks ago by suggesting a withdrawal from Bakhmut. So apparently, according to this report from Bild, Zaluzhny was saying that they should pull out of Bakhmut a few weeks ago, but Zelensky decided to hold on. So who knows if that's accurate? It's tough to say, but I think there have been signs that Zelensky and other top Ukrainian officials are not wanting to pull out of this city, and maybe he's trying to put it on his top brass there. And some of Ukraine's Western backers have expressed concern that Ukraine is wasting too many resources in the battle for Bakhmut. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said Monday that holding the city is more symbolic than strategic. And they're also downplaying the idea that it would represent a major loss for Ukraine if they pulled out of there. So I put a map in from South Front, and it actually looks like Russia made some gains in this city on Monday. Russian-led forces took control of a district in the eastern part of Bakhmut, and I saw other reports that said that Ukraine withdrew to pull its forces back to the central and western portions of the city. So Russia has been making gains around this city, and Ukrainian forces are taking heavy casualties. It was interesting. There was a report in the Kiev Independent, which is Ukrainian media outlet, very pro, Zelensky, pro Kiev, and they had a very long report about how Ukrainian soldiers fighting in this battle are not prepared and they're not receiving any support. So the Kiev Independent spoke with Ukrainian soldiers while they were off of the front line in a nearby city. The report said that they spoke of unprepared, poorly trained battalions being thrown into the frontline meat grinder to survive as best they could with little support from armored vehicles, mortars, artillery, drones, and tactical information. Explaining the lack of supporting fire for the infantrymen, a Ukrainian soldier and mortarman, he explained that they were receiving very little ammunition. He said, quote, "When we get ammo, we get 10 shells per day, 120 millimeter shells. That's enough for 1 minute of work," end quote. And he also said that they're using weapons, they're using mortars that date back to World War II, so very old equipment. And Ukrainian soldiers are often sent to the front line in Bakhmut after receiving very little training. Multiple soldiers told the Kiev Independent that some are barely given enough time to learn how to shoot a rifle, and they can be deployed to the front after being trained for only 2 weeks. So 2 weeks of training for people that don't have military experience, and then they're shipped off to the heaviest fighting in the war. Both Ukraine and Russia are keeping a tight lid on casualty numbers, so it makes it pretty hard to determine exactly how many people are being killed. But I think it is clear that Ukraine is taking heavy losses. Ukraine is also claiming that they're inflicting very heavy Russian casualties, but it's not clear how many Russians are dying in the battles. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground, they're facing off with both mercenaries from the Wagner Group and regular Russian forces. So the battle continues, it seems like, for now. All right. So the next one here, McCarthy, the House Speaker, has been convinced not to go to Taiwan, apparently. So Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen convinced House Speaker Kevin McCarthy to meet her in California instead of Taipei to avoid a major response from China. And this is according to a report from Financial Times on Monday. So McCarthy was planning to visit Taiwan like his predecessor, Nancy Pelosi, did in last August. And when Pelosi went there, it sparked the largest ever Chinese military drills around the island, and they've kept up the pressure on Taiwan. So I guess for some reason, McCarthy thought, hey, why don't we do that again? But now McCarthy is going to meet with Tsai, with the Taiwanese president in the U.S., and this move is meant to avoid a similar Chinese reaction. A senior Taiwanese official told the Financial Times that they shared some intelligence about what China is up to and the kinds of threats that they pose. Tsai's plan, the fact that she's going to the U.S., it still risks provoking a response from China as they oppose Taiwanese leaders traveling to the U.S. She has done this before. The last time she traveled to the U.S. was in 2019. At the time, according to reports at the time, China's response was muted. They didn't really do much. But tensions have really spiked since between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. So it's still possible that China could do something, but probably much less than what they would do if McCarthy went to Taiwan. So the Financial Times report says that Tsai is going to make the trip in April, and it's going to be she's going to go to New York and California. It looks like she's going to avoid Washington, D.C. And this is part of a trip to Central America. So she's going to stop in the U.S. as part of that trip. In Honduras and Guatemala, they have full diplomatic relations with Taiwan. They're two of the few countries that do. So that's probably where she's going. So anyway, the next one here, more about Taiwan. And this is Taiwan's defense minister saying that China could fly closer to Taiwan in response to growing U.S.-Taiwan ties. So Taiwanese defense minister Shi Kuo-shang, he said on Monday that China will use Taiwan's growing relationship with the U.S. as an excuse to increase military pressure on the island. So he told Taiwanese legislatures, quote, Beijing has been looking for excuses such as visits from high-ranking officials from abroad and frequent military exchanges between Taiwan and other countries to intensify the military threat. It is constantly adjusting the size of its forces, waiting to respond whenever a situation calls for more military action, end quote. So he says that Chinese warplanes could enter areas within 24 nautical miles of Taiwan's coast, and that's an area known as the contiguous zone. He says this could happen if McCarthy ends up going to Taiwan. He expects, again, there's that report that it doesn't sound like McCarthy is going to go, at least anytime soon. But he's saying Taiwan's defense minister is saying if they go, he thinks it'll be China will do even more than they did in response to Pelosi. So they didn't get that close to Taiwan when they did these huge military drills. They did simulate a blockade. They did fire missiles over the island, but they didn't get that close to the coast. There were reports at the time that said Chinese planes, I think, flew close, but then it turned out they weren't true. So anyway, where was I here? So this is, again, Taiwan's defense minister. He's saying that China could, without warning, break into their territorial sea baseline of 24 nautical miles. So actually, territorial waters extends 12 miles from Taiwan's coast. And that's also their airspace, 12 nautical miles. He said that if Chinese aircraft or warships enter the contiguous zone, Taiwan would restrain ourselves, say that they would exercise restraint and not launch the first strike to avoid giving China an excuse to attack Taiwan. But if China threatens entering the area within 12 nautical miles of Taiwan, it would be met with a response. He said, quote, we would be forced to respond should Chinese military vessels and aircraft come near or enter the nation's airspace and territorial waters, even if they are in disputed areas, end quote. So back in September, Taiwan's military shot down a drone for the first time that flew over a tiny islet in Kinmen County, also known as the Quemoy Islands. So this is interesting because it's a Taiwanese-controlled archipelago off the southeastern coast of mainland China. It's basically on the coast of China, and it's controlled by Taiwan. And they shot down this drone. This was in September 2022 that flew over this little island. And actually, the island that it flew over is only 2.5 miles away from Xiamen, which is a Chinese mainland city. If you're watching the video here, this is this little tiny island, and you see right behind it the skyline of this Chinese city. So it's all right there. And I think a lot of people don't realize that Taiwan does control this territory on the mainland. So, they shot down a drone over there, and that was the first time Taiwan did that, shot down a drone that entered airspace that it claims. And Taiwan described the drone as a civilian aircraft. They did not accuse Beijing of sending it, but it did fly from the direction of that Chinese city. And those drones started appearing in the area after Pelosi's trip to Taipei. So it did look like it was part of China's response. All right, the next one here. Bipartisan senators introduce bill to lift the trade embargo on Cuba. So, a bipartisan group of senators introduced this bill that would lift the embargo on Cuba to facilitate trade while maintaining other sanctions on the Cuban government. So, the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act was introduced by Senators Amy Klobuchar, Jerry Moran, Chris Murphy, Roger Marshall, and Elizabeth Warren. A press release on Klobuchar's website said that the legislation would eliminate legal barriers preventing Americans from doing business in Cuba and create new economic opportunities by boosting U.S. exports and allowing Cubans greater access to American goods. The press release said the bill would repeal key provisions of existing laws that block Americans from doing business in Cuba, but it would keep in place laws that address human rights or property claims against the Cuban government. So it sounds like they would still keep some sanctions in place, but lifting the trade embargo, allowing trade between the US and Cuba like that, would be a pretty big move. I'm not sure how much support this is really going to get, but I think it's a good sign. Again, you have Republicans and Democrats uh, introducing this together. So the embargo on Cuba, it's been in place for over 60 years, and it is a prime example of how U.S. sanctions don't work, or they at least don't achieve their stated purpose. Since the Cuban government hasn't changed in all this time, but the people of Cuba have suffered from the embargo. And the bill would repeal the original 1961 authorization that established the trade embargo. So during the Obama administration, the U.S. took some steps to normalize with Cuba, but they were all reversed by Trump. Biden has eased some very minor restrictions, but he also increased sanctions on the Cuban government, on officials and agencies. So again, this is getting a lot of support. Senator Klobuchar, she called for a fundamental change. She called to end the failed policy of isolation. And then Senator Moran, who's a Republican, he stressed, he focused on the fact that it would give American farmers access to the Cuban market. It could mean good business for them. So we'll see how this goes. Again, I haven't seen any sign from Biden that he's looking to ease the pressure on Cuba, but it is just ridiculous after 60 years that this embargo is still in place. And again, it hasn't done anything. So I just don't understand the argument against lifting it. All right, but that's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Stephen M. Walt. The conversation about Ukraine is cracking apart, and that's over at Foreign Policy. We have one from Doug Bandow and Adriel Casanta. Poland waits to pounce. That's over at the American Conservative. One from Andrew Corbley. Slowly but steadily, the executive branch is bringing back widespread drone warfare. And that is, discussing the drone strike in Yemen and, of course, all these strikes that have been increasing in Somalia. One from Ted Snyder. The U.S. is in conflict with countries for doing things we know they're not doing. That's over at the Libertarian Institute. And then our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone. We are losing our anti-war heroes right when we need them most. And she's there talking about Daniel Ellsberg. All right, that is it for me for today. Again, if you can, please contact your representative. Tell them to support that resolution to pull out of Syria. I think this is something we should definitely jump on. But you could always support us, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show on YouTube. Share it around. Tell your friends about it. All that. That's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.